Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's discussion of the liberal arts and the life of the university. This event is the third in this year's Notre Dame Forum series, which is focused on the question, what do Notre Dame graduates need to know? This theme was inspired by the fact that we as a university are currently undergoing a review of our core curriculum requirements, something we do formally once every 10 years. We are very fortunate to have with us this afternoon Duke University President Richard Brodhead, who will offer his thoughts on this question, informed not only by his current role, but also by his experience leading Yale University's core curriculum review. We will begin the afternoon with the comments from President Brodhead, followed by a discussion led by Dr. John McGreevy, Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, and co-chair of our core curriculum review committee. Dean McGreevy will then invite you, the audience, to participate with your comments and questions. I've been told he may call on people, so prepare for that in advance. After we finish the comments and question period, we'll conclude with a reception and continuing our conversation out in the Great Hall. At this time, I'd like to welcome Father John Jenkins, who will introduce President Brodhead. In addition to serving as the president of the University of Notre Dame, Father Jenkins is on the faculty of the Department of Philosophy. He has previously served the university as vice president and associate provost. He and President Brodhead have recently served together on the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. I now give you the 17th president of the University of Notre Dame, Father John Jenkins.
Thanks so much, Kasey. Good evening, all. Thank you for coming. It's really my great pleasure to welcome an honored guest, a distinguished scholar and leader, President Richard Brodhead, the 9th president of Duke University and the William Preston Few Professor of English. Professor Brodhead's prolific scholarship established his reputation as a leading interpreter of American literature from Hawthorne and Melville to Faulkner and Welty. He's the author of Culture of Letters, Scenes of Reading and Writing in 19th Century America, and the pioneering editor of the Diaries of Charles Chesnutt, the great African-American author of the post-Civil War period. As the former dean of Yale College, Professor Brodhead oversaw a sweeping review of Yale's undergraduate curriculum. His writings as dean led to the publication in 2004 of The Good of This Place, Values and Challenges in College Education. At Duke, Professor Brodhead has championed several initiatives that resonate with our values and interests here at Notre Dame: the interweaving of academic opportunities and the residential experience, the expansion of financial aid to more students in need, the application of research to global health problems, and an emphasis upon community service in Durham. His leadership in higher education led, as Kasey mentioned, to his co-chair of the Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. Formed at the behest of a bipartisan group of senators and congressmen, it produced a 2013 report entitled The Heart of the Matter, The Humanities and Social Sciences for a Vibrant, Competitive, and Secure Nation. I had the honor of serving on with that extremely distinguished group that included, among others, the presidents of universities, including Stanford, Harvard, Penn, and NYU, included creative people such as Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist, Emmylou Harris, the musician and songwriter, George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, and Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker. It had a Supreme Court justice, several business leaders, the journalist David Brooks, and John Lithgow, the actor. Perhaps the most significant achievement of our speaker's distinguished career is that he was able to bring that very diverse and creative group of individuals to produce an excellent report on science and humanities. I spent a long time studying our speaker's skills and his performance in that context as I was on that committee. And I observed carefully that to accomplish that feat, he had combined two very important qualities. First, he had to be one of the smartest people in a room of extremely talented people, which he was. But secondly, and even more important, he had to have the humility not to have to show everyone that he was the smartest. a quality he did not share with everyone in that room. My guess is that those two qualities are behind very much of the success Dick has achieved in his career. So we're just extremely pleased to have him. As Kasey mentioned, we are in the midst of our own curriculum review, and John McGreevy as well as Kasey are serving on that committee. So we're just delighted to have Dick with us, and I'm sure he will deliver a stimulating and enlightening talk. Dick Brodhead.
Well, I was getting apprehensive when you kept dwelling on the fact that I'm the 9th president and you're the 17th president. This makes me feel about half as good as you. But since you then went on to inform everybody that I was the smartest person in the room, even if I didn't seem it, I think I should not feel so bad. I'm gonna talk for a while, and then the talk is meant to be sort of a warm-up, and then we will have a conversation, and that's the part I really look forward to. It is a great honor to be asked to speak to you at Notre Dame. Notre Dame and I have a deeper tie to one another than you might have suspected. Early in their married life, my young parents lived in South Bend, and they moved out of this town when my mother was heavily pregnant with me, from which I conclude that the very idea of me originated in this place. I thought really hard how exactly to phrase that. In childhood, I learned of the formidable power of the Fighting Irish. In later life, I learned of the comprehensive excellence of this university, and for the past 3 years, I've known the university as represented by Father Jenkins. We served on the American Academy Commission, but you didn't mention it. Most recently, we served together on the Council of Presidents of the Atlantic Coast Conference. In both of these, I have found this gentleman to be an eloquent leader who addresses challenges of practice from a strong stand of principle, and no doubt that's why he makes a perfect president for this great school. So let me get down to business. I understand you have a topic for this year's Notre Dame Forum, what a Notre Dame graduate needs to know, and I understand that that topic was chosen in concert with an ongoing campus project, a reconsideration of your core curricular requirements. As was hinted a minute ago, I know a little about that kind of review. This is great. A huge mob is assembling. Come on, get the good seats. I'm just loving this. Text your friends. Perfect. Newcomers, the only thing you missed was the story. Well, maybe I won't tell the story. The story of how I was born shortly after my parents moved away from South Bend. Now I resume. I was talking about the fact that you're about to do a curricular reconsideration here, and I was just saying that I know something about this because I led just such an exercise at Yale in the years 2001 through 3. And on the basis of that, I would just say, as you perform this self-assessment, if I could offer one word of wisdom, it would be this. Please do be idealistic, and please do not believe that perfection is just around the corner. The fate of every known curriculum is to slip from aspirational intentions to operational routines. For that reason, it's good for us occasionally to look back from the rules to the intentions that tried to codify themselves in those rules. As Socrates, I think, said, an unexamined curriculum is not worth teaching. Such self-examinations have a further benefit, and obviously you're already enjoying it, which is they have the capacity to produce a broad community of reflection across institutions that in daily life tend to be broken up into departments, into divisions, into parts that each work with their piece of education without overmuch regard for the whole. That can yield deep and lasting benefits. And allow me to say, I even think that an exercise like the one you're starting can actually produce improvements in the requirements a school has in force. What we can't do is to solve the problem of education at the level of the rules. When I led the review of the Yale curriculum, I had occasion to reflect on an interesting fact, which is that outstanding schools have devised the foundations of undergraduate education in totally different ways. Brown is a pretty good school. Brown has no fixed requirements. Columbia is a pretty good school. Columbia requires all undergraduates to enroll in a common core of seminars focused on great books. Yale is a good school. It requires that students have a certain distribution of courses, but it allows them to satisfy those requirements on the basis of hundreds of possible classes in the offerings. Harvard is a good school. Harvard also has distribution requirements, but you have to satisfy those requirements for within a fixed set of so-called core courses. Now, if one of these models were actually absolutely superior to any of the others, we would know it, and we would know it by a very sure and certain test, namely, all the graduates of that school would be smarter than anybody else. However, in practice, many models of education seem to be able to produce acceptable and even impressive results, so that you might end up suspecting that the differences among them seem as much differences of institutional personality as of a deep educational result. In my experience, you tell me if yours is different, in my experience, when people set about to reform themselves, to make their personal natures absolutely otherwise, no matter how strenuous the effort, at the end of the day, they end up making themselves even more themselves. And I have found this to also be true of curricular reforms. Mutatis mutandis, a phrase I have never been able to say in public, but if I can't say it at Notre Dame, where could I? The things that were to be changed having been changed, Brown is ever more Brown-like, Columbia is ever more Columbia-like, Yale is more Yale-like, and Duke is more Duke-like, and when you finish, I do not doubt that Notre Dame will be even more Notre Dame-like than ever. I'm an English teacher, and I know a great couplet from the poet Alexander Pope. "'Tis with men's judgments as their watches, none runs just alike, yet each believes his own." I'm not arguing that the way colleges' requirements are articulated doesn't matter, still less that they can't be updated or improved. My point is that it's possible to engage in sometimes contentious group editing as if the phrasing of the rules could produce the desired result in students' minds, whereas at best, rules can only take us so far. As rules, a university's requirement can only absolutely achieve the following. It can specify what a student can't not do. That's what rules do. Also, by virtue of their required stature, rules often end up inadvertently making the means take the place of the end. Every faculty member in this room has been an advisor, and everyone has had a student come in and you say, "What do you want to study this term?" And they begin by telling you what requirements they plan to fulfill by what means, as if the fulfillment of the requirements were the end of education. And this is what I mean. I mean, as you begin this, you know this. You act as if the perfecting of the rules would produce the education, but actually it just makes a different focus on the rules. If a school doesn't have a culture of active inquiry and intellectual engagement supporting its curriculum, if going to College X doesn't mean entering into a force field that boosts every student's will to learn and grow and discover, then the best rules in the world can only engineer a conformability of transcript. With such a culture in place, many sets of rules can produce great results. Without it, you're only tinkering with the technicalities of compliance. So I've begun by giving you a stiff dose of skepticism. Having done that, I would now confess to you, I've read the Notre Dame college requirements very carefully, and in my mind, they actually deserve high praise. This is a school that is not afraid to say what powers it thinks an educated person ought to have. The rationales you've written for the different requirements, these are extraordinary pieces of writing. I would love to know the author of them. They're thoughtful, they're eloquent, they really make you want to raise your sights educationally. Most impressively, instead of articulating high-flown ideals with little relation to the specialized offerings that count to fulfill them, you seem to have devised a serious process for assuring that courses advance the educational goal they are allowed to satisfy, and to strengthen the educational mission of courses without tampering with their content. So I would say to you, I really think you are starting from strength. And if I could offer one practical suggestion, it would be, don't mess up. Well, I mean, it's possible to do so, you know. From here, it really can't be your hope that I will tell you how you should rewrite these rules. What you might hope, and what I hope I might be able to do, is to just give a little sense, pull back a little bit, and look at your project and mine in the context of the larger evolving landscape of higher education and the kinds of challenges that is posing not only to you, but to all the rest of us who offer a liberal arts curriculum. One challenge of this time, I think, is glaringly and unfortunately obvious. I allude to the facile negativism with which people speak about higher education at this time. After the 2013 State of the Union address, the Obama administration the next day issued report cards, dread word, measuring the cost of attendance, debt ratios, and completion rates for every institution of higher education. You may not know that Virginia pioneered a state of legislation, and other states have followed. Virginia law now requires every college and university in the state to post on a website a revelation of the salaries earned by students 1 year after graduating, broken down by majors. You can imagine what the intended effect of that might be. Measures like this codify a suspicion that college may well be a scam, a product whose high cost is not matched by any realistic benefits. Anxieties about cost, I think, are completely understandable nowadays. It is one of the many byproducts of the Great Recession that we have lived through and perhaps have not emotionally exited from. But in our day, this understandable concern about cost is driving an increasingly impoverished vision of the nature of education's actual value. The White House website will tell you the actual cost of attendance of Notre Dame or Indiana University or Ball State, and that is useful information, but it tends to reinforce the sense that the price of education is identical with its value. The Virginia website what makes it easy for you to figure out whether your son or daughter is going to be better off as a French major or a biology major, though I think you might find the results somewhat surprising. The Virginia website makes it easy to calculate the benefit derived from attending any institution, provided that the benefit is understood to be the salary paid by your first employer. And it's not just mass public opinion as registered in state and national politics that's showing this narrowing concept of education's value. Even among parents keen to send their children to liberal arts schools at which are all selective universities, we've seen a growth of the default attitude that the liberal arts have become a dubious luxury, wonderful, terrific in one's own time, but not advisable for one's college-bound children, whose main requirement is to emerge employed. In face of this utilitarianism that has become fashionable even among well-educated folk, I believe the Friends of Higher Education have a job to do. Without minimizing or ignoring economic realities, we have to say loud and clear what the value of education actually consists of. Liberal arts education isn't a matter of requiring students to pay quick visits to random unrelated fields on their way to a diploma. This education aims to engage multiple forms of intelligence to create deep and enduring habits of mind, an active, versatile, integrative spirit that's naturally disposed whenever it comes to a new fact or situation to use what it already knows to try to grasp that new fact, and then to try to use that new fact to recalculate or update existing understandings in that new light. The value of this habit of mind isn't measured by income alone. Its value is that it is equipment for living. Its value is that it supplies enrichment to personal lives, equips students to be thoughtful and constructive social participants, and prepares them to participate in a dynamic, ever-changing world that awaits them after college. I think it's easy to see why people get anxious about something whose payoff is not immediate, and the path to whose payoff is so oblique. But I'm telling you, the fact that it makes people anxious doesn't make it any less true. The fruits of such education, the fruits of any education, can only be reckoned over long time horizons as they enable people to rise to challenges and seize opportunities they could not possibly have foreseen at the time of their education. The lives of successful people almost never involve continuing to do the thing you consciously prepared for. As their lives unfold, these people find that by drawing on their preparation in unexpected ways, they're able to do things they could not originally have intended or imagined. And if you wonder what I mean by this, pick your own example. I've thought of two. Think of anybody who has led an interesting or successful life, and I think the point is made. I had the idea to pick Paul Farmer. I hope this is someone whose name is well known here. You've honored him many times. Paul Farmer is one of the premier global humanitarians, bringing the benefit of modern medicine to places where human need is great, but where a Western standard of care can't possibly be afforded. No doubt he wanted to be that global humanitarian from the time he was about 4 years old, correct? But it is not so. Paul Farmer went to college, in fact he went to Duke, with many unformed interests, and when he was pressed to say what major he intended, he thought he might major in chemistry. By chance, he took a class in medical anthropology in which he learned something about the social determinants of health, at which point he switched to an anthropology major. Do you know he graduated with a major in anthropology? Then by further chance, in an extracurricular activity, he did field work with a nun immersed in liberation theology who introduced him to the fact that Haitian farm workers were working in tobacco fields not very far from the place where he was going to college. Woven strand by disparate strand, these varied experiences created the sense of calling that then led him to go to medical school and eventually to become the founder of Partners in Health. Or I thought of another example, and I was pleased to see I went to Father John's office and I saw a picture of him there, so again I'm hoping for significant recognition. My second example is General Martin Dempsey. This is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is the highest ranking military officer in this country and the chief advisor to the president on the ever more mind-blowingly complex issues of national security. Martin Dempsey went, not surprisingly, to West Point, but after he began his military career, the Army sent him for a less obvious second education. They sent him to get an MA in English literature at Duke. You'll notice my fine tact. I have chosen all people who were brought up Catholic, although I must concede they all went to Duke. 2 years back, General Dempsey came to Duke and gave a talk, at the end of which he was asked by a student. The student just stood right up as if he thought this was going to bring the guy to his knees. The student asked him, what use, if any, your humanistic training could possibly have been to you in your military career? General Dempsey did not blink. It didn't take him a second to begin his answer. He said that it had taught him the importance of communication, a skill essential for any career. He said, plus his humanistic training had helped him to be a more reflective grasp on the meaning of experience. And then he said, and this is what I really remember, and now I'm going to quote, he said, that training opened his mind to seek, not just to accept or tolerate, but actively to seek perspectives other than his own and other ways of thinking. I doubt that General Dempsey learned all these things only from English classes, but my point is it was the whole of his varied education that prepared him for the whole of his successful career. By the time I'm done here, I'm going to have wanted to make 4 points about the current state of reflection on liberal arts education. 2 of these are generally affirming of the state of things, and 2 of them are generally challenging to the state of things. By now I've reached my first point. Namely, given the world we inhabit, we need to mount an energetic and aggressive defense of liberal arts education. We need to explain what this kind of education is good for and how it works, and we need to preach that not to each other, which is who we usually preach it to, but to the larger publics that either don't get it, or in my experience far more likely, are in fact not ill-disposed toward this philosophy of education, but haven't been reminded of it recently, and so have fallen prey to the chatter, the chatter that passes for thought in our general culture. In the wake of the commission I chaired, I spent a lot of time speaking in defense of the humanities in recent years. In recent years, I have found academics think that the public hates the humanities. This is actually not true. The public simply hasn't been reminded in any accessible way of the pleasure it daily takes in reading, in music, in film, in art. If you'll make this case in an accessible way that this is not something other to people, but something they actually already know and care about, I've actually found it quite easy to get people to acknowledge it. And similarly, when I cite examples of how a broad integrative education has prepared people to lead a life of active learning unfolding over multiple careers, Most skeptics that I have spoken to can be brought around pretty easily, and often after a minute or two, they'll begin trying to top your examples with examples drawn from their own life. So 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was at an evening event in Palo Alto, at which I addressed an audience of engineers. They may or may not all have been Catholic, but they did all go to Duke. At this session, there were questions and answered, and a person, in my line of work, you never know what an individual is going to ask you. And a person asked if I thought it was defensible that we were still allowing students to pursue pointlessly expensive education in the humanities. I gave my usual devastating reply. And at the end, during the drinks, this person and I began to chat. I learned that he was a software success who had retired at about the age of 50. So what was he doing now? He was passing his leisure reading works of history and comparative religion, QED. So my first point is this. This is a time for reasserting the why and wherefore of the liberal arts. It's not a time just for reformatting the rules. It's a chance for reasserting the qualities of mind those rules aim to support. The truism that higher education, now I'm passing to my second point, the truism that higher education should be cheaper frequently travels with the parallel notion that online everything can be done as well or better at a fraction of the expense, if not actually totally free. Now, the notion that everything that's done by residential cited universities will soon be replaced by everything being done online at no cost at all. You actually used to hear serious people say that about a year ago or 2 years ago. I think that like everything, that nothing can become universally believed unless it's fashionable, but fashionable things have to become unfashionable. And I think that particular half-truth has now had its 15 seconds of fame. In recent years, we've all become more imaginative about marrying online experiments with traditional pedagogies, and I do not doubt that we're actually still in the very earliest phases of discovery in that vein. But if there are things that can be learned well or better online, there are things that can never be learned except face-to-face through the living encounter of living people who are present to one another in the fullness of their humanity. We don't always remember this, but a fundamental requirement of the sort of education that you and I sponsor is that it's relationship intensive, the product of residential communities where people collide and engage one another all day long in ways both programmed and unprogrammed, and of a formal learning environment that's rich in personal attention and active personal engagement. So my second point is, as we make the case for our value to others, we need to ensure that we're actually living up to the full potential in our own institutional practice, or to put it more briefly, we need to make sure that we are making the time for the living interactions that actually transform lives. A university where the faculty are too busy to meet students is a university that actually isn't going to be able to deliver on that dimension of its promise. One thing the online world has given us, you all know this, is the ability to access what we want, where and when we want it. It used to be that if you were not sitting in the seat, or if you were not tuned into a channel at the appropriate time, you missed the show. This notion will be inconceivable to people in a few years. Like when people see a typewriter, what was that? There's a famous Claes Oldenburg sculpture of a typewriter eraser, but it's somewhat abstract, but now it's totally abstract because people have no idea what the thing is that it's a representative of. Anyway, as I say, it used to be you had to be somewhere to have an experience. Now it appears that nothing need ever be missed. And so it comes to seem increasingly an imposition to expect me to pay attention to anything except at my absolute convenience. This brings me to my third point. Though this state of affairs is unprecedented in human history, from now on, we're going to have to be living with that state of affairs, and universities are going to have to accommodate it. This challenge is far harder than some might think. Few cultural artifacts have proved as enduring as the conventions of academic study. An undergraduate degree requires 4 years. A year consists of 2 terms, unless you're at a place with a quarter system in which it consists of 4 quarters. The answer needn't be constant, but whatever the answer is, it's equally fixed in each different system. In each semester, you must take 4 courses, unless you go to a school where you're required to take 5 courses, in which point you must take 5 courses, or 4 courses sometimes and 5 courses in others. And you know how long a course meets? Courses meet at your university for 14 weeks. At Duke for 14 weeks, at Yale for 12 and a half weeks, but the answers are all fixed. You get my idea. 2 world wars, the rise and fall of fascism, the rise and fall of communism, the modern civil rights movement, the tripling of the world's population, the rise of federally funded research, not one of those potent events has had any impact on higher education's organizing forms. These units are like the prime matter of the philosophers. They're combinable into other substances, but immutable in themselves, at least until now. It's not going to be easy for liberal arts universities to adapt to the order of asynchronous delivery. The correct adaptation will also not just involve capitulating. Just as in the age of web surfing and continuous partial attention, universities have found a new mission in teaching people how to devote their full attention to things for sustained periods. So in the days of at-will experience, universities are going to need to cultivate the capacity to appreciate irreplaceable and unrepeatable experiences, to appreciate the difference between the evanescent live performance and the replayable YouTube, or the difference between the sudden living engagement with each other that a student and great teacher might have, how that differs from the best educational video in the world. But this needn't be an either-or, and we're going to entrap ourselves if we think of the choice that way. While continuing to cultivate what's irreplaceable in traditional instruction, we could begin to be a little more imaginative about different units and formats in which education could take place. I went to Stanford last spring. It wasn't the first time I went, but I saw things I hadn't seen last time. And there I saw something that I found truly mind-blowing. They have a place called the Design School. It's called the D School. The D is lowercase. The S is lowercase. It gives you an idea how cool this all is. And at the D School, they offer courses, but the genre of the course they offer are called pop-up courses. These are courses that don't begin until somebody identifies a need or a focus, and until some critical mass of people agree that they want to pay attention to that. And the courses are scheduled to take place just when it is convenient for the people who care about this to do it, and the course is over just when they feel they've got far enough along with the problem to set it aside. This sounds like nervous breakdown time for the registrar. But I'm telling you, I've seen ad hoc examples of something not too different from that, and no doubt you have too. Duke has an alum of our law school. He was the first Chinese citizen to pass the New York State bar exam. After he went back to China, he had an extraordinary career. These things would only be possible at one moment in history. He helped to write the laws that created the Chinese Stock Exchange. Then he managed the Chinese SEC. Then he managed the Chinese Social Security system. Then he managed the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund. Now he wants to teach at his old university, but he can't possibly come for a whole term. So he comes and teaches what we call a short course, a course that meets intensively every day for 2 weeks. So it's a real course, it's a substantive course, but it's not a 14-week course. As I speak, a member of the Duke faculty and his students are in South Africa for a program called Duke Immerse. These students have been taking 4 interrelated courses on urban politics and social justice. The courses are, among other things, about cross-comparative studies of the American Civil Rights Movement and the apartheid movement in South Africa. So these are courses where it would actually truly deepen the act of study to go be in South Africa at a certain point. The students had 7 weeks on the Duke campus, taking 4 separate but related courses. Then they adjourned to South Africa, where they're going to have 4 weeks of study that won't be broken into 4 parts, and then they'll come back and finish the term with us. It's going to be hard for creatures who are as much creatures of habit as we academics. We pride ourselves on our unrivaled creativity and freedom, but actually we are used to certain customs. It's going to be hard for creatures like academics, but in coming decades, we're just going to have to be much nimbler at improvising new formats, lest traditionalism of structure doom other forms of traditionalism that are more valuable to maintain. And this brings me to my 4th and final point. I think we're just going to need to be a lot more imaginative about what counts as education. Year after year, we've treated the formal elements of academic instruction as if they were synonymous with education itself. Have you ever been through reaccreditation? This is the most devilishly thorough process that anyone in the world was ever subjected to, and every 10 or 7 years universities have to go through it. But although it's devilishly thorough in one sense, it actually only studies one aspect of universities. It doesn't pay any attention to anything except the formal elements of instruction. If you want to graduate from Notre Dame, the only thing the registrar will positively check for is whether you have the formal elements of academic instruction in proper order on your transcript. Indeed, reassessment committees of educational programs usually focus on the formal elements of instruction. But students derive their education from a multiverse of sources, integrating academic and non-academic experiences in seamless, if idiosyncratic, fashion. So in a really deep review of learning requirements, it seems to me one is going to need to have to consider opening the lens. At Duke, we've pioneered a model in which students take things they've learned in class out into real-world settings where they're challenged to repurpose their skills in solving problems under real-world conditions. By this summer, we will have had 3,000 students, that's a lot of students, since the year 2007, who will have gone from Duke and spent some sustained period of time in international or domestic sites, addressing complex social needs of literacy, healthcare, health education, sustainability practices, clean water systems, a zillion others. I have had few more memorable experiences in my last 5 years. I would really only accept the marriage of my son. Few more memorable experiences than leaving Duke to go visit Duke students who are on site in Duke Engaged projects around the world. I can stop and think about visiting 2 Duke engineers who were in health clinics in rural Tanzania. They're all full of modern medical equipment. It's just been broken for years. So trying to figure out how to use their engineering skills, A, to fix this equipment, and B, teach people how to fix it themselves the next time it breaks. I can remember an extraordinary January day where I met a Duke student who had studied Chinese on our campus who was spending that term in China as a teacher in a so-called school for migrant children. China's migrants don't come from other countries, they come from their own rural areas, but I promise you they are treated no better and afforded no greater welcome than we are familiar in this country. The things I saw there, you multiply that by 3,000 and you got a pretty big number. These were not extracurricular activities or summer pastimes. This was education, a chance to learn the conditions of human life as they're lived outside the bubble of America's elite campus environments, and a chance to discover how skills learned abstractly in classroom settings could be applied and augmented in the world of actual human need. The success of Duke Engage has led us to create other programs combining classroom learning with experiential components. So we have a big global health program. It's newly available as an undergraduate major, also a minor, also a certificate program. That program supplements coursework with firsthand experience of global health challenges. We have a new program in financial economics. In it, students who have learned how to do problem sets are given actual real-time unsolved analytical problems by actual experts working in finance who then tutor them as together they try to work these actual problems through. We have a fairly new entrepreneurship program that combines classroom elements with hands-on, often internship experience in a great variety of forms. So last summer we had students in Silicon Valley, Duke in Silicon Valley, studying tech startups. We had students in Detroit studying social entrepreneurship. We had students in Chicago studying arts entrepreneurship. It's pretty much everywhere now. Increasingly, we see such experience as education, a means to knowledge that can be richly combined with other means to knowledge, not a practical substitute for liberal arts education, but an animating addition to such education. I don't pretend that everyone on our faculty has fallen in love with these programs or converted to them, and I don't pretend that we have solved every complex question about what counts for what for credit hours, though on both counts we have made progress. What has gained ground is the perception that these mentored real-world engagements are not alien to our fundamental mission. I have a friend named Eric Toon. He's the head of our program in innovation and entrepreneurship, and he introduced me to a passage from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead that I had never seen before. I probably have never read anything by Whitehead before, although I've always known his name. Here's the passage. It's from an essay called Harvard the Future, written in 1938. What the faculty have to cultivate is activity in the presence of knowledge. What students have to cultivate is activity in the presence of knowledge. This discussion rejects the doctrine that students first learn passively and then, having learned, apply knowledge. That is a psychological error. In the process of learning, there should be present in some sense or other a subordinate activity of application. In fact, the applications are part of knowledge, for the very meaning of things known is wrapped up in their relationships with things beyond themselves, so that unapplied knowledge is knowledge shorn of meaning. Who can say? It may be that either you guys or some successor committee at Notre Dame or somewhere is going to be finding possible new requirements in a passage like that. I come to my end. I came to have a conversation. You might say, well, you're making it hard to have one since you continue to drone on. I came to have a conversation, and I am now willing to begin that conversation because by now you have surely caught my point. Here's my point. This isn't the time to abandon the liberal arts. What that mode of teaching contributes to individual lives and our social welfare is inestimably precious. We need it now more than ever. But lifting up the liberal arts need not only entail defending the exact state of our current practice. Why couldn't this be a time of renewal, a time for protecting and even improving on what's best in current practice, and for imagining new ways that the dream of human empowerment can be realized among the new facts of our changing world? What a great job for a university committee. I commend you for your labors, and I wish you courage in your task. Thanks very much. I'm going to sit down now, right? Cool. Me and my water.
Thank you, President Brodhead. Let's get to that conversation. We'll have up Dr. John McGreevy, the I.A. O'Shaughnessy Dean of the College of Arts and Letters and Professor of History.
So I said that I would be happy to moderate this conversation, but only with the participation of the audience. So I see a lot of familiar faces out there. If you don't raise your hands, I'm going to call on you. I'm just telling you that now. So maybe just to get started, both Father Jenkins, maybe I'll call on him as well, and President Brodhead. I guess we've learned that President Brodhead's accomplishment was to corral not only Yo-Yo Ma, George Lucas.
George Lucas was the challenge.
And Father Jenkins into agreement on the state of the humanities. What's happened since the report? And do you think the state of the conversation on the humanities and the liberal arts and sciences more generally has changed over the last couple of years?
You know, we had well in mind the fact that there had been a committee structured in a parallel way to ours had led to the founding of the notion of STEM. The notion of STEM education as a national priority and national need, that even the term didn't exist 12 years ago. And a commission appointed by 2 senators and 2 congressmen did the labor and came up with that argument. And it led to, you know, it certainly hasn't solved the STEM problem, but it has led to national attention, the devotion of resources, all kinds of good measures. The difference between STEM and the humanities is that, at least at higher education level, it's principally the federal government that who's caring or not caring is what funds STEM research or doesn't fund STEM research. And that's very different from the humanities. The whole budget of the National Endowment for Humanities is trivial. It's a small fraction of what our budget is for our humanities departments. The humanities are something that are local. They're local to communities, they're local to states, local libraries, local historical associations, universities, all kinds of things. And so we've had a somewhat harder task of trying to figure out how do you get in touch with that whole universe, that whole archipelago of possible allies, and give them a sense that there's a positive argument to be made. We all fantasized that as soon as the STEM report was called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, we thought as soon as that report came out, the STEM legislation was passed. But it wasn't true. There was a period of going around, talking to people, persuading people, enlisting allies. And so we knew that's the work we set out to do. There's been a lot of discussion in the wake of this. I don't pretend it's all been caused by us. But I think people have woken up to the need and to the pleasures of making this argument. As I say, it's not as if people don't like reading. Yeah. It's not as if people don't like music. The desire is there, and just to ask people to pay attention to it and to give it some degree of value. I think we're making progress. Everything's challenging in our culture because anything that, what was I about to say? I was about to say only negative things have the ability to command public discourse in some sense. But we make our progress.
Father Jenkins.
I would say that the success of the committee is evidenced by the fact that Dick Brodhead appeared on the Stephen Colbert Show. That is kind of a clear mark of cultural impact. But
Since Aquinas, the high watermark.
you know, it's interesting. I felt, there was no one in that room who wasn't completely committed to science and humanities in our commission, but really the discussion was about, in a way, how do we sell this to the public and help Congress people who want to. And in a way, I think you said it well, it's a bit about giving people the opportunity to reflect on their experiences and the value of humanities in their life and giving them a language to speak about. I don't know if you agree with that.
I loved being on it with you, but the people who were great on that commission were people who are not humanists. Okay, the head of Boeing was on it, and he said, we will only ever hire engineers, but you won't get promoted beyond a certain point if you don't have communication skills, if you don't have curiosity about crossing cultural boundaries, and those actually aren't engineering skills. The person who'd been the head of the surge in Afghanistan was on our commission, who talked about how expensive it is to conduct a foreign policy if the only tools you have are weapons, as opposed to cultural understanding, historical understanding, understanding of other people's religions, other people's ethical systems. So we learned a lot about ways to make arguments. The point is, it's always tempting in the world to make an argument to someone else, you stupid. To make an argument to others that would be highly convincing to yourself, and then when they're not persuaded, you make it louder, and then you think they're a stupid person. This is actually not the way persuasion works. Persuasion involves finding what someone else cares about and finding out how to put your point forward in such a way that it registers on their scale.
You've been the director of a curricular review at both Yale, and now you've been the president at Duke.
But I'm not going near it.
What?
I'm not going near the curricular review.
All right, well, tell us what you think was great about what you accomplished at Yale in the curricular review and what you think, that was left undone. Then tell us, and I actually see I would just say this for the record, I see two Duke faculty that we've recruited to Notre Dame cowering in the back.
They're sitting together over there.
Professors Katongole and Musa, and they might want to jump in.
No.
What do you see?
They're dead to me.
They're dead to you. Okay. So what worked and what didn't at either Duke, from your experience as president, in terms of general education, and what worked and what didn't from your experience as dean and then chair of the curricular committee at Yale?
Yale's a wonderful, wonderful school. It has wonderful students, a wonderful teaching culture. But there was always a problem, which is that the science labs are located about a mile away from the undergraduate residences and uphill. Humanities and social sciences are 2 steps away. The natural sciences are a long way away. And thus, although every student coming there had multiple APs in the sciences, after people were there about 2 weeks, they all came up with the same phrase as if they were the first people who ever thought of it, I'm not a science person. And the thing is, Yale's former curriculum required that you take a certain number of classes in each of the divisions of knowledge. But the trouble is, the classes were identified by the place of appointment of the instructor. So the point is, you'd find the science class with the least science in it that met the furthest away from any laboratory setting, and you take that, and that would satisfy the science requirement. So the curriculum was full of perverse incentives. And so that was really a main thing, was trying to figure out, how can you generate an appropriate curriculum of science, of real science classes for people who aren't pre-med? That was one of the real problems, is everybody would get low grades because other people were doing it to get into medical school, and so we basically figured out how to generate an appropriate curriculum for satisfying that requirement. There were lots of things we did, and I'd have to say, it's funny. I wrote the preface to this. It's in this book you mentioned. It's printed in there, called The Good of This Place. It's funny to read it. As I say, you remember every battle, every concession, everything that went into it. But at the end, it's really that exercise that led to the stuff I started with, which is, I think it's not unimportant to work at the rules, but it's so easy to persuade yourself that the writing of the rules is the solution of the problem of education. And actually, it's just an element. It's an outside element. And if, as I say, if you don't have a culture of inquiry, you can't solve the problem that way.
Now, none of this is going to get back to Durham, but what works and what doesn't at Duke from your vantage point as president?
I'll tell you, the current Duke curricular model was published while I was leading the Yale one. which was very, very interesting because we saw it. Duke articulates a system where there's so-called areas of knowledge you have to take classes in, and then there are so-called modes of inquiry. And it's actually an interesting way to articulate things. It has the unfortunate fact that it makes it sound as if you have rows and files, and so everybody's looking, I'm looking at a Duke graduate very dear to me in the second row here. Is it not true? Do students not look for the class in X area of knowledge that knocks off the most modes of inquiry? And so very soon, I looked at it and I thought, boy, that's great. That's a great system. But then I heard that it was called, I don't know if it still is, but it certainly was in the first years, curricular bingo. A 5 under the N, there you go. And I'll tell you, it is, students, the mind is naturally lively. It's naturally looking for things to enliven itself with. And you hate the fact that when students come to college, they spend so much time saying, I've still got this sub-requirement of this sub-requirement left to meet, and use that as the lens for choosing your education. Finding a way to solve that problem of false motivation or inverted motivation, that's the hardest thing. At any university, I'm sure it is here.
I want you to start thinking about questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then I want people to have questions ready. Otherwise, the people who I know best here, I'm just going to call on and ask you to say something. Here's a tough one.
Okay.
In a lot of ways, Duke and Notre Dame are very similar in the types of students we recruit. Occasionally, there's faculty interchange. We like to think more of it's from Durham to South Bend than South Bend to Durham, but nonetheless, there's a lot of back and forth. Both have big sports programs, a lot of similarities. Big difference is, of course, Notre Dame's a Catholic university.
That's true.
And as an outsider to our community, what do you think? How should that shape our general education? So since the 1970s, general education at Notre Dame, in terms of its Catholic character, has been carried by 2 theology courses, 2 philosophy courses, for lots of good reasons. Our charge as a curricular committee is not only to sustain, but to deepen our connection to the Catholic character, and I think that's absolutely crucial. That's Notre Dame's comparative advantage. How to do that is a pretty open question. You could talk about a global requirement, because Catholicism is a global institution. You could talk about ethics requirements. You could talk about something about global south, global north, a whole range of things to instantiate Catholic character in general education. You're an outsider, no one's going to hold you to this, you can go home, and no one's going to ever ask you this question again. Any thoughts?
Wow. My religious upbringing was influenced by the Protestant Reformation.
Okay.
And if you are looking for me for the secrets of Catholic education, this marks a moment in ecumenical history that I would like to just underline. I would say this, one of the really interesting things in this country, people all around the world know the greatest universities are in this country, the great majority of them, but if you look at them, they're different from each other. This country doesn't have an educational system. Schools aren't replicas of each other. They have different character, they have different histories, they have different ambitions, and it's for that reason that if I were the president of Notre Dame, I would be insisting on the Catholic identity of this university. That's your differentiator. And you don't want to be all different, but you don't want to be no different. And so it seems to me that then that does pose a challenge for you. I actually think reading your rationales, if you guys, I'm not addressing this to the students in this room, if you don't read these rationales like at least 3 times a term, you're really missing a bet. They're really, really, really well done. They're way better well done than the ones at Duke or Yale, in my opinion. And they're full of aspiration. They're not dogmatic, but they are spiritual in their aspiration, it seems to me. Now, as for how you're going to take, the trouble what you just said, okay, to theology, to philosophy. So instantly you can see the bingo mentality, right? Bingo. A theology class that also meets some other requirement, or maybe it's taught in French so it could fulfill my foreign language requirement, or maybe in Latin. The trouble is requirements as such invite the mentality that is the opposite of the one we seek to cultivate. That's the trouble. So I'd have to say, I think however you write the rules, the trick is to have the courses on offer that are interesting. Should you have a requirement in the study of the Global South? I think that would be absurdly overspecified. At the same time, if you had 15 fascinating classes on the Global South, I think that would be amazing. And especially if you had classes on the religious life of the non-Western world, even the history of Christianity in the non-Western world, which is such an amazingly interesting subject.
Terrific. Questions from the audience for our distinguished guest?
These are the people you
How
told.
about Mark Roach and then Bill Miss Campbell, I see in the middle, and other people should raise their hand. I'd love to get some student questions. Mark?
Thank you very much for an excellent set of comments. I agree with all four of your points, and I want to push you a little bit on the fourth point, that we need to be more imaginative about what counts as education. In the light of an issue where perhaps diversity is not as appropriate as it is in terms of the distinctive identity of an institution by way of curricular requirements, and that is the puzzle, what to do about students who are taking AP courses in high school. The generic frame at Notre Dame is that counts. We can substitute that for college work. We need to be flexible. And there are some persons on campus who say, well, foreign language learning, let's say at the high school level, is not the same as college level foreign language learning, which is of course more than foreign language learning. How have Duke and Yale dealt with this issue? What were the most persuasive arguments for and against giving the...
Listen, I'm a pro on this question. It may not be the thing I would most boast about, but I will tell you, when I went to college, I went to a college that had 8 requirements you had to meet, all of which could be met with AP courses. People didn't have as many APs as they did. I never took a math course in college because I had AP calculus. I actually never took a serious science class except for one because I had APs in that area. And actually, in retrospect, I think that is horrifying. What it means is that I was free at age, I had just turned 17 when I went to college. Virtually at age 16, I was free to decide that I never wanted to learn anything further about these vast domains of knowledge. The trouble is your freedom can condemn you to a life of ignorance. Right, and it's one of the reasons. What does in Paradise Lost? The famous life, thyself not free, but to thyself enthralled. That's a state you can get into. I do think one of the things that was important and successful about the Yale venture I participated in was the idea that whatever you've done before should not exempt you from a requirement. That a requirement should be phrased in terms of distance traveled. So we had the requirement, if you already know multiple foreign languages, that doesn't exempt you from college study. It means you start there and go and travel some further distance. If you start from 0, you travel this distance. If you have advanced composition, you travel this distance. And we made it possible to fulfill part of that by bilingual experience in a foreign culture during college. I think that was a good thing. I'm not sure you could do it with every AP, but I think that it I think it matters. Otherwise, you're going to have this funny situation. The more affluent the high school you went to, the more APs you can take, the fewer things you're going to study in college. It's odd. I mean, you have a funny, it works strangely for both sets of a student population.
Bill.
Thanks very much for your presentation. This follows up a little on John's point about us being a Catholic university. And one of the great selling points in days of old about the liberal arts was a sort of intellectual and moral formation.
Yes,
People were
exactly.
trained to be wise and good. Colleges, contemporary colleges, face all kinds of challenges, jock culture, drinking culture, hookup culture, etc., as we do here. What counsel and advice could you give for how the sort of intellectual and moral virtues, character, education, etc., might be integrated into our liberal arts education so we're producing or helping folks grow to be wise and good?
These are great questions. I mean, these are the profound questions of our curricular review. Nobody thought that liberal arts education was abstracted purely into the intellectual realm. It's not just a matter of the organization of disciplines such as you would find in our catalog. It's about self-formation. That's really what it's about. And I think sometimes we forget about that in the way we talk about it. But if it's going to be about self-formation, then you're really talking about the growth of someone's whole self on campus, and that means, among other things, their ethical self. Now, the notion, how do you do that in a university? You require that someone take a course with at least 4% ethical content. You know what I mean? And so somebody can take a study in close reading of Kant's Third Critique, and that will count as fulfilling your ethical requirement. Surely that's not what we had in mind, right? But I'll tell you, I never yet found a program any school can require that makes people good. It seems to me what you can have is a community of people who talk openly enough about enough hard issues that people can learn from one another's example and wisdom. One of the difficulties that happened with the growth of highly specialized expert faculty training in modern times is that faculty a little lost their sense of themselves as exemplars, as adults, as people who've actually been through things and now can speak from a position of more experience, which doesn't mean people don't have to live their way forward to their ethical education. Nobody ever became more ethical by passing a test on it. That's my own view. If it doesn't have a lived dimension, it hasn't entered your ethical self. I would say, I do think in a university setting, why do we have so many extracurricular activities? Actually, these things are all part of self-development. They're much more interesting thought of that way. Even athletics is, because if athletics isn't developing characterological traits, it's a wonder we spend so much time on it.
Other questions?
There's one back up here.
Yep, up over here.
Thank you so much. My sister actually goes to Duke, so.
Excellent.
Nice job, so everybody can hear you.
Say that line again really loud.
Thank you, and my sister goes to Duke, so she's a sophomore and loves it. And I'm writing a thesis, and I'm looking at the long-term impact of, I'm writing a thesis, and I'm looking at the long-term impact of tutoring on tutors in the Writing Center. And I love that you've mentioned the communication and the curriculum, especially your last point about talking about the hard issues in a community and
right.
that extracurriculars can be self-developing. So I'd like to know your stance on how the writing program at Duke functions after the first year requirement and how that community discourse around something such as writing can be helpful in development.
Okay, you have a way better chance of having your students learn to write well if you have things like a writing center, if you have classes whose teachers are actually trained in teaching writing. That's useful, but writing is like everything else. Taking one course in it may satisfy the writing requirement, but no one ever became a good writer by taking one course in it, right? It takes a persistence. It involves learning how to pay attention to yours and others' uses of words, and that can start in a writing class, but it has to carry on it has to be reinforced in multiple ways. Something I like about the Duke requirements is you have to take a writing seminar, but that doesn't fulfill the writing requirement. You actually have to take 2 other classes that aren't courses in writing, but that pay the kind of attention to writing that suggests that this is a multiply reinforced trait. I think that's the way it's got to be. Something I find very interesting now is the growing attention in the last 10 years or so to spoken communication. Colleges used to act as if writing papers was synonymous with education, and you would sometimes have students who would be asked in some formal setting to say something, and you were just sometimes astonished at their inarticulateness. Indeed, one is often astonished by the inarticulateness of one's adult contemporaries, right? A person who can learn how to put 5 words together in front of each other, how to take a question and put some thoughts into actual words that make some sense. People think that you have to have majored in econ to have a successful career. I'll tell you, a person who can speak effectively is on their way to a successful career, and a person who can't is not on their way to as successful a career as they might wish.
Professor Musa, I think had a question.
I told you, not him. Hello.
Hi, thank you, Professor Brodhead. I'm sure that the humanities can resuscitate within you a sensibility to resurrect me after you've declared me dead. See, I'm at the Catholic University.
I see Catholicism is taking its toll on you, my friend.
Thank you very much for your great comments. I was particularly interested in the way in which you talked about the pleasure that we get out of reading and listening to music. And I was wondering, are we successful as universities in translating these great skills and qualities turning those into values, and values that we can, I don't want to use the word sell or market, but at least communicate to others how valuable this is. And I'm sure that we can do better. I always am astounded when I'm addressing people at law school, or you get law school students in your class, or people from the sciences. You give them opportunity to write an essay on the history of Islam or religion and so on.
Sure.
They get so excited.
Exactly.
Because they're doing something
it's
different.
interesting.
They're finding it interesting, and so I was wondering, what kind of thinking in your commission or what other leaders at the university are thinking about, that wouldn't be time that we begin to introduce crossover classes?
Yes, exactly.
Because in literature, in book publishing, everything is now about crossover.
Sure.
How do you make the mixture? And I'm sure people are going to say, who's going to teach those classes? Well, you have to bring 2 or 3 people into the classroom. So I'm wondering what your thinking about this is.
I hope he's on the commission. He's on your commission. He'd be good. He'd be a real troublemaker. You'll never get it resolved with thinking like that going on. But I do see the value of it. You know, we live at a funny historical moment. We live in a moment with a lower toleration for boredom than has ever been known in all of recorded history. Right? No one can, you know, if you have to spend 5 seconds without being able to turn on a video or turn on a piece of music or something, it's a crisis. This is a problem because the things people turn to for entertainment aren't actually as entertaining as the things there are in the world that could entertain you. Okay, I've just read this 600-page history, the re-argument of the causes of the World War I, called The Sleepwalkers. You know, this thing is riveting. It is hard. It is heavy, but it is riveting. You know, and I'll tell you, watching you know, some movie for the 8th time is actually less riveting. So it seems to me, the obligation we have. The novelist Henry James said something once. He said, the only obligation a novel can have in advance is to be interesting. And actually, I think it's something we have to remember, that no curricular requirements are going to work unless unless the education is offered in a way that makes it interesting. I don't mean cheap, right? But I think that engages with the live curiosity of people on the other side. I do think, you know, that the old liberal arts curriculum was taught by people who were themselves widely trained in the liberal arts. In the last 100 years, we have developed a new way of training faculty members in which you have to you know, leave father and mother and cleave to, you know, German or what's your PhD in? Religious studies, yeah, but even there you always have to go into at least, when I was dean at Yale, there were 10 subfields of religious studies, and people did not typically study across the walls of the subfields, right? That's actually, that is so antithetical to the nature of either liberal arts education or to what makes an interesting person. Nowadays, what students want, what students need, is the ability to take something from one context and carry it into another, and then into a third. You know, our world requires, above all, a kind of adaptive intelligence, an intelligence that's always putting things together anew on the fly. And that's something we could be offering in our curriculum, but we're not going to do it if we begin by separating everything out and have it taught all by people who only know that one thing. Right? It's a great challenge. I do think that it's one of the difficulties that universities have in this country is we don't have a way to train faculty members who we're eager to certify except by way of separating the very pieces of knowledge that we want our students to be able to integrate.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to go back here, the student right here.
And then there's a reception so we can talk
Yes,
more out there.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk, like, these secular schools are successful in, like, even though they have different, like, core curriculums. Right. For further, like, wondering, like, how do you measure that success? And then if we think of, like, especially at Notre Dame, Catholic school of liberal arts as described by Father and Miss Campbell, like, moving the virtues and character, is that measurable? And if it isn't, do we still do it?
If you want me to answer, let me start that sentence again. There's a famous quote, though I've never seen it in the original. You know, there are many famous quotes by Einstein that no one can find the original in Einstein. There's a famous quote, you can't, something what you can't measure. What? Help me with this. It's a super famous quote. The whole point of which...
We only deal with authorized quotes.
If you can't measure it, it can't matter to you. Yeah. But this is absurd. Some things can be fully measured, some things can be partially measured, some things can scarcely be measured. The trouble is, the thing you have to understand about education is education works obliquely over time.
what things in my education helped me later on. I continued to discover, 20 years after I was out of college, things that I had forgotten about that gave me the ability to intersect with some discussion or line of discovery that I had later on. So, it's one of the fallacies nowadays. People want to give tests to students the day you enter college and the day you exit college, and that will give the metric for the value of your college education. It doesn't. It's going to get you about 3 dimensions of a 1,000-dimensional problem, and it's going to make you pretend that what the test gave you as a result on day 1 and day 3, that's the measure of the growth. But that's not the way humans grow. So I would say, I myself am under continual pressure to come up with metrics for things. Let's have metrics for things that lend themselves well to metrics, and let's realize that there's other kinds of metrics. I'll tell you. You raised the question: how do you know that these different models of education do produce successful results? I only know one test for it, which is when you meet people in later life and they seem smart, all there, alive, I say, you probably had a good education. Now, maybe I'm giving credit to their school that the school didn't deserve, but I don't know any other test for it. And I'll tell you, that's a test I subject people to every time I meet them. If you meet someone who seems to be mentally inert or not to have taken in any new thoughts for, one does meet these people fairly often, right? I don't care what school they went to. They are not. It does not raise that school in my esteem, or them, either.
So that's our final question.
That was the final question. Wow.
And then.
Yes. Well,